about. And I'm going to introduce you to Steve Wright, who's going to talk to you about 30 years of publishing success.
Thank you everybody for coming. So yes, thank you Tracy for inviting me to talk about 30 years of publishing with Kelsey Publishing. This is our story, it's our journey. Some of it may resonate with you, some of it may be of interest, and we've tried to look at areas outside of just the news trade, and also to look a little bit as how things may be changing going forward. If anybody wants to ask any questions, feel free to do so as we're going through. I'm conscious that we've got meetings starting again, and I will make sure we're finished before the next round of meetings start after lunch. So I ought to talk a little bit about the 1980s, because before Kelsey Publishing was formed, we did have a different business, and we had essentially one magazine, which was most of the company, which was Practical Classics. We had no internet, no computers. The first computer we got was in 1984. And it cost more to print one page, one colour page in a magazine, than it costs today to print the whole magazine. It was a very different environment in the 1980s. In 1989, our magazine was sold. We were left with one very small magazine and a car show. And that was the start of Kelsey Publishing. To set the scene, in the UK environment, no internet. You got all the important news from the newspapers to keep you up to date. Nothing, no fake news obviously in those days, everything was all real. Everything was black and white. You had the little red top, but throughout the newspapers they were all black and white. International affairs, poor Rock Hudson who had AIDS, Nancy and Ronald Reagan wishing him to get well soon. And royal babies. We had royal babies as well. Some things don't change. In 1986, the newspapers Today came out, and it was the first colour newspaper. A bit fuzzy in some ways, but that was the start of colour being adopted properly by the newspapers. Looking at design. So, you know, we create our magazines, we get good content, we have to do a load of design work. Now this is The Face. An interesting magazine, it ran for about 25 years, and it's just been relaunched as a quarterly, as a high-value premium quarterly product. Back in the 1980s, look, this is the design. Something that if your child came home from primary school and presented to you, you'd be quite pleased about the work they've done. It looks quite good, doesn't it, in that context? That's the 1980s. There's NME, another magazine that's no longer in print. Again, a very, very basic design. So looking at Kelsey Publishing, here's our one magazine we started with, Stationary Engines. 40 pages on stationary engine. That was a full-time job to produce that. Does anybody recognise the engine? Does anybody recognise the familiarity with the engine?
Is it Thomas, his engine? No.
No, but interesting that on the reception to this conference, we're at the Waterworks in Berlin with a much larger version of this engine. You see the driving belts and everything, and the big engines in the middle. So there's a little bit of a history there, linking in again with this event. These engines from the 19th century were essential. You didn't have cars when these engines were invented, and they were used for pumping water, and they were used for generating electricity and all sorts. And so we still publish this magazine today. It's now full colour, 68 pages, good value. And it takes 3 days for a designer to put that together now. So the technology, in terms of production, has been revolutionised over the decades. Looking at the news trade, when we first started in publishing, we had something called firm sale. I don't know if anyone remembers that. Firm sale means you give them the copies and they pay you the money. They don't pay you based on what you sold, they pay you based on what was supplied. So of course now we have something called sale or return. And if they haven't sold, they get a credit. Who knows how that will move in the future? Obviously, some retailers are being paid on pay on scan, and so that, these things are developing and changing. 1989, we had sales efficiencies of 60%, and obviously it would be a joy to work to those levels now, but that's the market we're in. Supermarkets were expanding into magazines and newspapers, and sales were growing really well. Our first major launch as Kelsey Publishing was Tractor and Machinery magazine. We had tried other small products, and even that did really well in the supermarkets, and Tesco's gave us a great allocation to grow that magazine. At the time, everyone would laugh about doing a tractor magazine. Why are you doing a tractor magazine? It seemed like a rather interesting thing, but maybe a bit quirky. Why did we launch a tractor magazine? Well, I've actually got a video from my dad here who's going to tell you a little bit more about it, because clearly I'm not old enough to have 30 years of publishing experience with me, but so I've interviewed my father, who's going to make a couple of appearances.
So tell us about Kelsey Publishing and when you launched our Tractor magazine.
Well, at that time I had an art studio and one magazine, so I was hardly a publisher, but the one magazine I had was for old stationary engines, which we found there was a very small but useful following for, and it was enough to make a small profit. But as I was going to these many meetings for stationary engines up and down the country, I could see that at the meetings there were far more tractors than there ever were stationary engines, and I couldn't understand why there wasn't a magazine for tractors. So I decided that I should try and get a magazine out for tractors. The problem was that I actually knew nothing at all whatsoever about tractors. So I had to try and find somebody who did. The only one that I could go to turned me down and said that I would never get anywhere with the tractor magazine. He asked me how many did I think I could sell, and I said, well, I think I could do at least 15,000 copies. And he said, not in 1,000 years, you will never manage to do that.
So to summarise that, we've been going to a lot of the shows, trying to sell copies of Stationary Engine magazine, trying to sell subscriptions, raising awareness of it, and looking around and thinking, well, there's 35 stationary engines here and there's 200 tractors. Maybe there's more of an opportunity in tractors. We sold 6,500 copies of Stationary Engine magazine, and we felt there must be an opportunity with tractors. There was only one very small subscription magazine available with tractors, and the editor said, 2,000 copies, that's all I've ever sold. Whatever I do, I never sell more than 2,000 copies. You're bonkers if you think you can sell more. So what did we do? We took it to the news trade. We launched a 48-page magazine, and 10 years later it was 200 pages. It was a huge success. This magazine drove our business forward for 10 years. At the peak we sold more than 4,500 copies just in Tesco's. We sold more than 35,000 copies on the newsstands, and we had a maximum sale of over 55,000 copies and an annual ABC of over 52,000 copies. This was one of the biggest specialist magazines in Britain, and it just shows you where you think about where your opportunities are. Maybe try with something a little bit small, maybe do some research, but these opportunities are out there, and the opportunities are still out there, but they might be harder to find. So 1990s, we would do other launches, and we sometimes would take out a newsletter and test the market with a subscription product. Sometimes we launched products subscription only and then put them onto the newsstand. And it was our decade for launches. We didn't make enough money to make acquisitions. We were growing the business, but in the 2000s, that was our decade for taking on licenses, which was a really important phase again for our business. And here are four products, the four main products that we licensed in the 2000s. And the most important one was Classic Car Weekly, which was a phenomenal success for us. And essentially, we were in the market where larger publishers had products that weren't working for them, the business model wasn't quite right. Maybe they tried to sell them, or maybe they didn't want to sell them for a reason. And so often, an opportunity might arise for licensing. And again, I'm going to come back to my dad and see what he says about Classic Car Weekly.
So tell us about the license for Classic Car Weekly.
Well, the publisher at that time was asked if he could actually increase the circulation, and seeing the history of it and where it was going, he felt that he couldn't. So they said, in that case, then see if you could find somebody who's willing to take it on under a license. We were asked to take on this publication when it was at about 15,000 copies a week. We'd never had a weekly magazine, so it was a little bit worrying, because I could see that if we got it wrong, we'd actually be losing money 4 times quicker than we would be on a monthly. But I felt that we could improve some of the content, and we had a few ideas of what could be done. So we took the plunge and we decided to go ahead and take it on.
So a big risk, a very big risk, taken on a weekly specialist newspaper that probably wasn't profitable at the time. Annualised RSV, which might sound good, of £1.1 million, but you're producing the product every week to generate that. On the newsstands, 14,500 copy sales with a £1.50 cover price, 51 times a year. So what did we do? We put in more pages, lots more pages. We improved the content, and we improved the distribution. We put more copies into the supermarkets. We put more copies into WH Smith's. We put parasite units into WH Smith's, because the newspaper needed to be in the category, not with all the other specialist newspapers. And we saw huge growth, to the extent that by the time we got to the end of that decade, 2009, we had annualised sales of £3.1 million. We had an ABC for August of 30,000 copy sales, 15,500 copy sales at £2.20. I think that's a little bit of a typo there, I apologise for that, but 30,000 was our ABC in August. And it was the largest motoring publication owned by Bauer, but Bauer had licensed it to us and they weren't publishing it. So all good things came to an end and they took the product back. And it's still a very successful product that they thank me for, but never mind. Let's look at the revenue mix. Let's look at how our revenues have changed. I think this is interesting and not surprising. Essentially, 30 years ago, we had 3 main revenue streams, and for us, the news trade has always been, or had always been, by far the biggest. And in 1989, more than half of our revenue came from the news trade. Most of that would have been from the UK. And about a quarter coming from advertising, and about a quarter coming from subscriptions. And we all know things have changed. We all know we're pushing into new areas to try and generate revenues and try and make products profitable. And in some areas you have to do one thing that you don't do elsewhere, and to get the revenue in to try and maintain profitability with your various brands. However, in 2019, the news trade is still our biggest revenue stream. It's still 36% of our total revenue, even though we've got 18% revenue coming from new areas or other areas. We still have a similar mix in terms of advertising and in terms of subscriptions. Looking at the other areas to show you where we have developed, most of it is in events. Most of it is in car shows, actually, linking to a lot of the car titles that we produce. Digital advertising is at a very low level for us, but it is growing strongly. We recently bought Stuff magazine, but if I put that to one side and look at a like-for-like growth in terms of digital advertising with our legacy magazines, or the ones that have been around for a while, we've seen growth of 77%. So that surprised me actually when I looked at that. I wasn't expecting to see that. but it's starting from a very small level. And for some magazines, they're only profitable because you have the digital advertising. Some magazines will only be profitable because you've got digital circulation. And so they're all part of your mix. But again, the news trade for us is vital for almost all of our magazines. And bookazines is an area where we're currently getting 6% of our sales. It's an interesting discussion point at the conference today because lots of the distributors are telling us that they're seeing growth in the category for bookazines. And it's an area which we're really keen to exploit and to develop. I thought I'd show you a bit of a summary of the journey for the last 30 years. The top chart is quite a pleasing one because it just shows you everything going up. And starting with revenue of nothing and ending up with revenue of 25 million, which is, for us, something we're happy with in terms of the progress. The bottom chart is showing you the annual growth, the growth in our revenue each year as a business. And you can see in the 1990s, we're growing very strongly. You can see the impact of our tractor magazine, where we had 70% growth one year and over 60% the next year, where we really saw strong improvements in sales. And then we had a steady period of growth in the later 90s. And then I mentioned the period of licensing, where we took on a load of products, mostly Classic Car Weekly coming into effect here, really delivering some growth. And it wasn't until 2012 that we had our first year of decline, and actually we started seeing maybe a bit more challenges that you see that had been prevalent in the industry for some time. The 2010s, as I called them here, we entered a new phase as a business, and we were still looking at licenses, but they were coming to an end, and we're moving more into acquisitions and more into the diversifying into new areas. In terms of acquisitions, I was quite impressed actually when I put these all up together. These are some of the brands that we've acquired in the last 10 years. And the relevance of talking about Classic Car Weekly and Tractor and Machinery is without the strength of those titles, we wouldn't have had the capital or the ability to buy any of these products. So we've been in a very fortunate position to be able to have a profitability within the business in order to take advantage of any restructurings and changes of direction that may have happened elsewhere and to take on new titles. And most of the magazines we've taken on have fitted well into our business in categories we work in, and sometimes we jump out of our comfort zone and try something new, and normally it works. It doesn't always work, but that's how we've basically grown in the last 10 years. Now, this chart may be familiar to a lot of people in the UK. This is showing you the industry in the UK in terms of positive growth at the beginning of the 2000s, but continual shrinkage in terms of the news trade sales. So that's the environment that we've been trading under. You can see that around about 2005 was when the deterioration started, and it's been pretty strong, up to sort of 10% decline in copy sales and maybe roughly 6% per year since 2008. For Kelsey, we were a little bit lucky because being a very specialist publisher in the early years, we were slightly immune to that. And looking at the period from 2005 to 2009, when the industry is starting to go into decline, this chart is showing you copy sales, and that's showing you the RSV, the sales value at retail. And you've got 5 years of decline, whereas at Kelsey we were still growing our sales because Tractor and Machinery was firing on all cylinders, as tractors should do. And Classic Car Weekly was performing really well as well. So we were actually benefiting at the time when the industry was under pressure and actually paper prices were declining, print prices were declining, responding to the industry. So we were very fortunate to take advantage of lower costs and higher sales. And again, that allowed us to make more investments and to grow our business. This might be a little bit cynical in terms of the last 10 years. We've been in a bit of a hamster wheel or a wheel of fortune where it's been hard. We've had years where the business has shrunk. We've been working really hard to try and maintain profitability. We borrow money, we buy some magazines, we reduce the costs, we spin things off, we repay a bit of debt, we close something if it's losing money, the business shrinks. We borrow some money and we go round and round. And actually it's worked as a growth strategy. I've shown you a lot of the titles we've bought, but looking forward, we have to look at the sustainability of our brands and see where we can grow and how we can make the most out of things. So we are pushing ahead with bookazines, we are developing in events, and we are beginning to see some digital actually making a worthwhile contribution to the business and being very important for some of our brands. In terms of bookazines, the point to note, I suppose, we looked at how many products do we produce a year, and we produce onto the newsstands in the UK and mostly for export as well, more than 1,000 products a year, and these are nearly all magazines, issues of magazines, and so all that content, all that archive of content is constantly being growing and building up, that puts us in joint third place with Immediate Media in the UK in terms of the number of products produced, and so gives us a great, obviously, archive to draw upon in terms of launching and developing bookazines, which work both in the UK and internationally. So it's an exciting area we are developing in. In terms of export, since we're here at an export conference, I ought to perhaps put some relevance on that. Psychologist is our biggest export title. It's our biggest title in the UK as well. And I thought it would be interesting to see how it's performed in the export market compared to the UK. And the lessons that perhaps this draws. Because actually export is quite challenging, you know, because you've got to try and get a foreign language title in many ways to sell in a very crowded newsstand in different countries around the world. But with this brand in particular, we've seen good performance, and we've seen it outperforming sales in the UK. And by the way, Psychologist has performed well in the UK. It's a very strong and resilient brand. So coming here is important for us. We recognise the need to focus on export. It's an important part of our sales. It's a good opportunity for our bookazines and other areas of the business. And so obviously something we're going to continue to focus on. So what have we learned in 30 years? Well, I say focus on your strengths and explore all opportunities. We've always been in the motoring category, and we've developed into tractors and machinery, but we've explored areas outside of that, and I think you've got to be open-minded, but weigh up the risks. Understand your audience and understand what they want. It's all about the audience, isn't it? Now, in some ways, we talk about our audience, and the audience, I can't remember who was presenting yesterday and saying that the audience is the reader, and there's a load of cheers. Of course the audience is the reader, but we've got 25% of our revenue coming from advertisers as well, so we need to be mindful of what they want. And advertisers are asking us to connect with through the digital means as well. So there is an important area to develop online, and it doesn't mean you can't also grow copy sales. Some of the marketing we do to our online audiences is great for raising brand awareness, selling bookazines, selling subscriptions, and obviously if people don't subscribe, well, they're going to buy copies on the newsstands as well. So we do a lot of contact there. Don't expect an easy ride. I mean, we all know that it's a very challenging industry. We're battling revenue declines in many areas, but we know the industry is going to change, and we've got to be open-minded with it. Thank you for listening. If anyone's got any questions, fire
You've
away.
answered them all. You've answered them
I've got the business. Clearly, Mastermind did a really successful business over the last 10 years and looks in good shape. What keeps you awake at night? What do you see on the horizon which is going to derail the master plan?
What stops me from sleeping?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm very good at falling asleep. I do wake up very early in the mornings. I think for me, it's a little bit boring, really. But when I refer back to the sort of the wheel of borrowing money and investing and paying back debt and what have you, it's we have to run. Unfortunately, we have to run our businesses like accountants. We have to make sure that everything adds up, and sometimes we have to make hard decisions with assets, and we have to decide where we invest our time and effort, and when we need to close the title, for example. We're not in the luxury of being able to support products that have no potential for being profitable. I mean, in our business, we've got over 65 brands, and 80% of the revenue, you won't be surprised, comes from the top 15 titles, and 80% of the profitability comes from the top 12. So nobody wants to close a title really, because once it's gone, and we don't necessarily know what the future prospects are and where the revenue's coming from. I've said how some titles might survive and be profitable only because they have bookazines from recycling their content. Some may be because of the digital circulation or digital advertising. I don't want to be the person to close a product that's been running for 120 years. And obviously there are implications for people working on products. So I think we have a responsibility to try and manage our assets in a profitable way while remembering, what we're trying to do, what are the core values. So it's that, it's trying to keep things healthy and relevant.
Any more from
Oh.
Tesco?
If you could do one thing differently, Steve, what would it be with the benefit of hindsight?
If I could do one thing differently, if I could be a publisher in the 1980s with costs of today, that would be what I'd do differently. So, I suppose someone else may have said that, but the revenues back then were great, weren't they? But as I said, costs were a lot higher in terms of production. But I think, but we do learn things, and do you know what? It would be good if we could the things we know now, if we would have known before. Yeah. I can't think of anything else in terms of.
Okay.
We like to be quite. We are passionate about what we do. We are enthusiastic, and we like to be committed. I've got Anne Saundry in the room here, who bought Aeroplane magazine from me, and maybe if I had my time again, I wouldn't have sold it.
That's honest.
But it went to the right place. Yeah.
Any more questions for Steve? Okay. Well, first of all, can I offer my sincere thanks on all of your behalfs, but from a personal note also, to Steve for agreeing to take this on. You've been a relatively small audience, but a very attentive one. What's really good about this is we've got it all on film, so now we will take this and we will put it onto the New Training Foundation website. So if what you've heard this afternoon you think would be helpful to people in your teams to hear about this 30-year evolution and all the great information that Steve's given, then please refer them to it. It'll be on the website this afternoon, I think. You could even go and see it on the stand. So thank you, Steve, very, very much. It's most entertaining, as I knew it would be, and thank you all for coming.